So as I said, welcome. Thank you for joining us for session 3 of day 2. The topic for this session is online work and resilience, and it's part B of this topic for the conference, and we have 4 papers being presented. My name is Carly Vickers. I'm a designer and associate lecturer at UNSW Art and Design and the academic lead for the Innovation Hub, which is an interdisciplinary problem-solving initiative within UNSW Arts, Design and Architecture faculty. I'm really pleased to join everyone today for this fantastic conference and to be chairing this session. Before we begin, some housekeeping. Each of the 4 papers will have 15 minutes today, and I will give a reminder in the chat at 10 minutes so that you know that you've got 5 minutes to go. I ask that everyone keeps their cameras and mics off for the presentations, and then we will do a group Q&A at the end for all speakers where we'd love to see everyone's cameras on and mics on and have a great discussion about what was talked about today. So the order of the session has been updated, so I placed that order in the chat if anyone needs to reference it. Stephen Goddard, my colleague, and I will be kicking off, followed by Jung and Echo Pam. Nerina Dunt will be 3rd and Katie Lee 4th. And also, if you have questions as the presentations are progressing, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll go back and find them ready in the Q&A session. Okay, so I think we are ready to kick off. The first presentation, as I said, is from my colleague Stephen Goddard and I. I've already introduced myself, so to introduce my colleague, Stephen is a lecturer at UNSW Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture, School of Art and Design, and is a practicing designer and curator. Today we will be presenting together a paper called Resilience Building in Graduating Students, the Role of Scalable Communities of Practice. Over to you, Stephen, and I will share screen.
I'll just wait for the slides to come up.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Is that working?
That's great, full screen mode. Fantastic. So when in January 2020, news of a new coronavirus was emerging in Australia, for teaching staff at UNSW Art and Design, the question of having to divert teaching and resources online was not prominent in conversation. And you can see from the map, at this moment in January 2020, there were 8 or 9 cases, I think, in Australia. In a fundamentally hands-on teaching environment, it seemed inconceivable that studio-based design practice could be conducted in anything other than a face-to-face modality. The conversation, when it did begin to emerge, seemed to be focused on what parts of the learning experience could translate, should that need arise. Barely halfway into a first term of teaching, with a fortuitous 1-week buffer of scheduled non-teaching at UNSW, not only was a pivot necessary within a 10-day window to a fully online delivery, but the same occurred across the country and the world. The devastating effects of COVID have been wide-reaching for arts education and the creative industries generally. Over the course of 2020 and 2021, just 1/3 of our teaching weeks will have been on campus, on our campus studio workshops and studios. And you can see from this image what the feel of the campus has been like largely for the last couple of years. As co-conveners of the final year major project for the first time in the significantly revised design program at UNSW School of Art and Design, our questions have now turned to the impact that a lack of intensive studio and material interaction in the degree will have on cohorts into the future, and this remains to be seen. As we look to the next iteration of the course in 2022, understanding how students' skills and approaches to design problem solving have been shaped by these strange times and circumstances will be an important opening conversation when discussing the ambitions of the students' graduating projects. As context for this presentation, the Bachelor of Design program is a 3-year degree with the option of a 4th honours year as a 1-year intensive. The program offers 6 disciplinary specialisations in graphics, object, textiles, interaction, experience and 3D visualisation, of which students choose 4 disciplines as an introduction in their first year and then extend 2 through to the completion of their degree. Along with a strong focus on contextual studies to support these specialisations, the degree is structured around a core stream of 6 design studios, which you can see in blue on the top line of this, this schema, and the studios that we're talking about today in the 3rd year, studios 5 and 6, which combine to give the students the opportunity to produce a major project. In the core studios, it's where students will learn to apply foundational design principles, industry practices, practice methodologies, and skills in interdisciplinarity. These core studios are designed to develop the designly thinking and approaches of the students. and high-level skills in collaboration, giving and receiving constructive critique, ethical practice, and the further graduate attributes necessary for contemporary design practice. This paper reflects on Design Studios 5 and 6, which combine to create the students' graduating major project, and in particular, our experimentation with resilience building through scalable communities of practice that the students undertook.
While resilience and scalable communities of practice sat at the core of the design of the major project course, the disconnection and disruption of the COVID pandemic accelerated the prototype development of these initiatives and magnified their effectiveness in ways we didn't foresee. By resilience, we mean the ability to adapt, recover, and if necessary, change trajectory throughout the course of a design project or process. This is not a new concept to design education and goes hand in hand with iterating in the unknown spaces of design practice. More than this, however, we see resilience in design practice as the ability to continuously respond to new and shifting parameters, reframing them as purposeful and productive for the process, even when they are as dramatic and unrelenting as a pandemic. We see the support and scaffolding provided by communities of practice as essential to this, where COPs are defined by Wenger Trainer as groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. While the multiple, scalable, and networked COPs we will map in this paper were designed around tangible categories of disciplinary specialisation and studio cohorts, these communities taught the students far more by way of resilience in being and becoming design practitioners together, much like the ants supporting each other on screen. We propose that at the core of the resilience and responsiveness required from current design graduates is the ability to build relationality and seek new perspectives through a multiplicity of means. We therefore sought to develop the students' capability to create connections and define the relationships within their cohort through a spirit of generosity. This approach aimed to frame the outcomes of all the students within the cohort as a collective responsibility, rather than the traditionally inward focus on individual ambitions. Grocott, McKenty, Coleman, and Mannix outline a pedagogical approach to modelling and scaffolding risk-taking in design students, proposing that the focus of design has shifted from making things to making sense, making possible, making right, and making happen. This extends the often overused trope of designers as also system and service thinkers to designers needing to be a certain way in the world to effectively change and imagine new futures. While Grocott et al. Addressed this through risk-taking, we aim to address this through relationality. Pragmatically, we sought to build these qualities in the student cohort through a number of objectives. Firstly, by breaking down patterns of one-on-one feedback with their lecturer that students so often come to rely upon for project progression. And secondly, we sought to develop students' abilities and confidence in giving and receiving constructive critique. And finally, we embedded processes of reflective practice beyond the iterative cycle of their designing and making, and also asked them to consider ways of being, engaging, interacting, and relating within the cohort.
Reflection through mapping was an overarching strategy within the course structure, and this was explored both through individual student projects and the meta-philosophy of the course. This was especially important as a methodology for planning and communicating the pedagogy transparently to students. So as an example of this course mapping, the diagram that we're looking at here was developed during the initial iteration of the first half of the course. The diagram was presented as a step-by-step animation and discussion piece used for locating key project milestones. The course diagram commences with a rapid activity that students undertook in which they understood the various parts of their degree as an interconnected ecosystem within an interdisciplinary framework, which is an important underpinning of networked and scalable communities of practice. To connect interdisciplinarity and to materiality, the final layer of the mapping activity asks students to iterate their maps in a physical or digital material form in a short time frame. And what we're showing here are some examples of precedents that we showed to students. On the left, Stephen Banham's presentation of his Legible Cities PhD at RMIT, and a piece by Margaret Woodward that was held at Dome Gallery. And in both these cases, you can see the mapping of practice and projects put into a physical kind of form, particularly in the left-hand example where Banham is mapping his graphic design outputs kind of across time, across sort of chronology. What this process did was to underscore the breadth of material practices of the cohort. giving us insight into a critical need for the supportive communities of practice that we'd planned. Some practice maps were relatively conventional in form, using recognisable data visualisation techniques, but interesting material responses included the development of maps as woven objects, as sculptural ceramic pieces, and complex hand-rendered illustrations. The results of the activity therefore became a visual indicator of the disciplinary strengths of the students and flagged the potential communities of practice that would be formed in a more intuitive way. Furthermore, this scaffolded our interdisciplinary lecturing staff in understanding a wide range of student specialisation within the studios and therefore the unique and diverse levels of support that will be required. While communities of practice have a practical basis in terms of the underlying approach to pedagogy, we believe that there is benefit in mapping and diagramming this more rigorously for the student cohort and the lecturing staff. And this reflects the transparency and teaching approach that we've sought to achieve throughout the course. The theme for this conference made reference to Leonard Euler's Seven Bridges of Konigsberg. This evoked previous exploration of John Woods's deployment of Euler's tetrahedron-like network, in which the sum of the potential interactions is greater than the number of agents. So that is, at its simplest level, for any 4 agents, there's the possibility of 6 interactions. And you can see that that jump in the first two, the top left 2 parts of this diagram. Woods describes this as quadratic consciousness. This theory can be applied to explain an exponential increase in the number of agents and therefore interactions, forming a background theory for the collective design wisdom of communities of practice for future student cohorts. The diagram sequence expounds this theory. At 5 players, the interactions have doubled relative to the number of agents, and at 7, the interactions have tripled. Complexity then increases when the agents are considered in terms of their variety of the relationships and their roles, including students, peers, tutors, conveners, mentors, and studio support. And you can see that in the bottom right-hand diagram.
So how did we build these communities of practice? For students to develop and practice their skills in relationality, a clear and facilitated system for them to practice within was necessary. This system of scalable communities, which we designed to mirror industry practice scenarios such as small studios, art director feedback, tissue sessions, client relationships, and experimental practice, provided students with the context to engage and reflect upon their own ways of being as designers. Pragmatically, the COPs were achieved through a series of facilitated relationships by the conveners within the major project cohort, with the individual student at the centre. Firstly, we asked each student to establish a buddy within their studio class. The buddy system encourages students to create accountability through a learning partner. This partner attends all feedback sessions, assists their partner with catch-up work, and understands their partner's project at a detailed level. Building on this, we asked students to establish close groups of 4, which they would join for studio activities. These groups simulated working in a small industry studio and were used for learning and practicing design processes and methods. When learning in these groups, we purposefully provided new and simulated design problems for students to practice their skills, encouraging a move away from fixating on individual work when in group scenarios. With just the buddy and the group of 4, staff then had modules of 2 and 4 students to work with in different combinations throughout the course. For example, 3 groups of 4 would be half the class when organising students for certain activities. Students were then supported through the traditional relationship of the lecturer, who met with them in 2s, 4s, or combinations, and furthermore, activities were designed to encourage strong relationships across the studio groups of 24, as you can see on screen, such as tissue sessions and frequent peer critique. This ensured that students were invested in all the projects within their studio and therefore shared knowledge and learning across the materiality, the processes, and the ethical practices of 23 other projects. To connect students across the cohort, communities of practice based on specializations were established using the Microsoft Teams platform. So what you can see on screen, everyone holding a red flag is indicative of being in the same disciplinary specialisation. So for instance, they might all be textile students. Staff were also assigned COPs that reflected their expertise to facilitate these communities throughout the week. So as these textile students met online, a textile staff member also met with them, even if they weren't their regular lecturer. In addition, further relationships were established, including either a mentor, client, or stakeholder relationship from industry for every student, and strong relationships with the Making Centre staff on campus, all with the view to building student resilience in seeking assistance and seeking advice and seeking collaborative experience. Finally, relationships were built across the cohort and across the modalities of face-to-face and the online classes through cohort question times, where classes met simultaneously at strategic moments within the curriculum design. As you can see, if we overlay this system with our previous network discussion, this creates a complex map of relationships through which the students could travel around and practice and reflect upon their relational skills.
Our method to both the communities of practice and cohort question times was to use technology in real time to connect face-to-face groups in different teaching spaces with online classes accessing the courses remotely. Our early prototypes of the technology enabling these hybrid teaching moments revealed the importance of implementing custom teaching kits, which appropriate Jabra Office speakerphones to minimise the audio disruption that multiple devices could cause in spaces of close proximity. And this will be the focus of our iteration moving forward, as maintaining a cohesive cohort across locations is key to the resilience that we're trying to promote, alongside our own adaptability in times of unpredictable lockdowns. Ultimately, this communities of practice prototype sought to demonstrate to the students the relationality at the heart of design practice, mirroring the evolution from the lone design hero to a collaborative facilitator. This was built upon encouraging students to move through the course in a spirit of generosity and collegiality with their peers and for the benefit of all student projects. Students responded positively to the greater relationality built into the course, noting that the change of emphasis that we'd implemented. As this was a pilot and deployed in extraordinary circumstances given the pandemic, we acknowledge the need to iterate the systems that we established. As discussed, this will rely on stronger processes of embedding the system with available technology, and critically, and this is part of what we're going to use the research we've generated in this presentation for onboarding all of our staff going forward. We also acknowledge that in this presentation, we're unable to include documentation of the scenarios and student projects because we don't have the right ethics approvals in place, but we're actually going to seek to do that for future presentations of this, the iteration of this work. On reflection, we feel satisfied with the extent to which we've developed new approaches to teaching, innovations in online delivery, and conversations about possible hybrid modes of interaction going forward. Thanks very much.
So that's all from us. I'll just stop sharing my screen. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll save all the questions for the end after all of the presenters. So give me 2 seconds to find my notes. Okay, so our second presentation is from Jung and Echo Pam. Jo is the coordinator of Games and Interactive Design at the School of Arts and Humanities at Edith Cowan University, and Echo is the Inbound Study Tour Coordinator and Lecturer in the School of Arts and Humanities at Edith Cowan University. Jo and Echo will be presenting the paper, Dissatisfaction from Students Who Experienced the Adaption of Design Workshops to Online Classes. Over to you.
Oh, hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm just gonna try a different view. Is this working for you guys? The right view?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. I'll get started. Hi there, my name is Echo and I, as I've just been introduced, teach on the Bachelor of Design at ECU with Jung. Like so many educators across Australia and across the world, we moved our classes online suddenly in semester 1 and semester 2 last year. This presentation and our paper addresses some of what we learned from this experience. These 2 points here are pretty good indications of what happened when we moved our units online last year. We saw an increase in numbers of late withdrawals and fails due to non-submission of assessments. So I'm going to kind of get into this a bit more later, but this is sort of like indications of what happened in our units. Oh, PowerPoint isn't moving. Is it moving now, Jo?
No, it's just a cover screen or the first slide.
It's frozen. I'll stop and start again. How's that?
Can you try to press the forward?
Yeah. That
No.
moving now?
Should I share mine?
Hang on. If I try moving it in using my, how's that? Is that moving now?
No.
I'll try a different view maybe. How about this?
Yeah.
So weird. Might stop and start again. I'll try that one more time.
No worries.
The irony of this is not lost. All right. How's that looking? You got it back?
No, it's not moving.
How about now?
Have
Oh,
you? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Movement. We got movement. Okay.
Success.
Oh, where was I? Okay, I was talking about, I was going to begin to talk about our classes. So design majors in the Bachelor of Design at ECU feature this studio-based learning model that I think a lot of design degrees feature. Basically, what we have is a 3-hour block, and in that time, lecturers will present a little bit of content, then break off into groups. Students will get into a bit of group work and sort of make things and do things, and then we'll come back into a sort of big group together, and the lecturer might give more content. Then they might break off again and do some different exercises. So in the 3-hour block, there's a lot of change, and it's a real learning through doing approach to teaching that we take here. There's a lot of simulated industry projects we have. There's a lot of prototyping, evaluations, peer review, a lot of collaboration between the students, and a lot of sort of change within our 3-hour teaching block. It's pretty different to your standard lecture and tutorial format where the students are sort of seated and it's a bit more static. After the transition to online learning, we found that there was a real lack of engagement with our students, reduced interactions, feelings of detachment, reduced motivation. They talked about having been frustrated by having a lack of access to our facilities, and some of them had IT problems. Reassuringly, I suppose, or interestingly, there's really similar findings in the TEXA survey that was done last year about the student experience of online learning. So, I think we had fairly similar feedback from our students than a lot of people had. One way of gauging the effects of this sort of sudden change to online learning was to have a look at our end of semester surveys. So our unit and teaching evaluation instrument surveys, or our UTEI surveys, are presented here for 3 units comparing 2019 and 2020. And you can see from the data that there's a drop in student satisfaction, and that's across a lot of areas like assessments, organisation of the unit, teaching, the extension of learning, and just generally overall satisfaction. So yeah, it was down, and in particular, one unit where the scores were really low was a 3rd-year game design unit called Advanced Game Design. And interestingly, this is a unit that consistently scores really highly in our UTI scores. It's a well-received unit. And in the formative unit experience survey that we had when we just moved to online learning, students seemed really happy with the change. They seemed to like it. They were satisfied with the performance of the teaching staff. They appreciated the preparations we'd made for online learning. They liked the materials. But by the end of the semester, when the final UTEI was conducted, the students expressed that their online learning experience wasn't great and that it wasn't appropriate for that unit in particular. I think what's particularly interesting about this unit is you'd sort of presume that game design students would be these nerdy introverts who'd be really kind of comfortable with learning online. And Joe and I often sort of joke about the game design students when we, you know, see all of our students together in the different majors. The game design students are usually a bit quieter and shyer and not as good at communicating. But, you know, despite the fact that we assume that just because they're digital natives, they're happy to learn online, they really weren't. They learn a lot in game design, even though it's very computer-based, from peer feedback and collaboration. Testing whether or not a game's working is quite a subjective thing, and it's really important that they get the chance to show their peers that they can play the games and they can give them feedback. So, you know, a unit that you would have thought would have transitioned well online really didn't. And this was one comment from one student in the UTI on that unit, them saying that it's a very hands-on unit and it's been extremely difficult to complete alone without the support of on-campus tutorials and lectures. So, you know, I think students indicated that watching the pre-recorded lectures wasn't engaging. And over time in that unit and in a lot of our units, that lack of live in-person lectures led to reduced motivation. And at first, really, the attendance and the enthusiasm was pretty good. We had quite good peer-to-peer and teacher-to-student interaction. We used discussion board and students were coming to the live online classes. But over time, fewer students participated and the quality of the participation really dropped. Another comment here from a student saying, I don't think this unit functioned well as an online unit. I missed a huge amount of the learning experience of making a game while isolated. Game design is all about collaboration and this was impossible from home. So then the negative reaction of students to the online learning experience is really apparent when you read comments like this. The other interesting thing was the UTEIs didn't really change that much in a lot of our units. They dropped a little bit, but it came through in the comments that students didn't enjoy the change. I think they appreciated that it was unusual circumstances and the staff were trying as hard as they could and the content was good, but it was the format that they really struggled with. The other barrier or the other issue to shifting these type of classes online is that the students then didn't have access to the space and the materials or the technologies that they needed. Some of our students moved back to their homes and they moved to remote towns. So like one of our students moved back to Esperance, which is over 690 kilometres away from Perth. They had pretty poor internet connection. And, you know, when all of the students were accessing our portal at the same time, we had issues there. And a small number of students had really old laptops that didn't have cameras on them. And because we were in a lockdown, they couldn't go out and buy a camera or, you know, there were postal delays. And so they missed a big chunk of that interaction online because of that. So when the second, in the second semester, when we went into another snap lockdown and suddenly moved online, we changed our approach a little bit and we learned some things from that first semester. We still proceeded with pre-recording our lecture material, but instead we sort of reduced that down to under 10-minute chunks to try and replicate that content to the whole group and then move away and work on something, then come back and get some info and then move away and try something else out, nature of our actual studio classes. And I think that made it more palatable for the students and kind of easier to be a bit more self-directed and actually respond to the content a bit better. We also included copies of lecture notes with detailed kind of narratives of what each slide was about, so that students who had issues with accessing the online lectures could just read them instead. We also asked students to view all the pre-recorded material before they came into still having live classes, but we used that class time more as a chance to break out into groups and collaborate, to discuss the lecture topics, to provide a kind of Q&A session, and maybe even bring in some like industry engagement and some guest speakers as well to keep things sort of different and interesting and changing things up a little bit. Another change we made was that we also introduced individual consultations, because we realized that this was something that was missing as well when we moved online. That moment that you have with students before the class starts or after a class, when they come up and tell you about the issues they're having and why they can't hand their assignment in on time, or what they're struggling with, or even those moments when they want to ask a question because perhaps they're too shy or kind of embarrassed about asking in front of the big group. And we felt that that was really missing. We had the sort of like longer semester one sort of version where we didn't have individual consultations. So we set up a live Google consultation timetable, and students could book and drop in and have a sort of one-on-one session with staff if they needed to. So we made tweaks and we made changes, and I think that it greatly improved things in semester two when we did it again. But ultimately, I think despite our best efforts, a major barrier to this transition, or this successful transition to this away from this face-to-face mode of teaching, was that even with all of these things, chats and you know, live sessions and individual consultations, we still couldn't replicate that engagement with peers and academic staff that happens when you're actually in the room. And I think that absence of that campus-based social experience alienated some students. It really contributed to some poor academic performances for some of them, and added to kind of problems that people were suffering from in terms of mental health at that period anyway, because it was a difficult period. So what have we learnt, and what does this mean going further into the future for teaching design online? I think we can assume that, I think we often think that technology can solve a lot of problems, but you can't undermine, or you can't ignore the human factor. Without us actually being in the room together and keeping students accountable by being there and noticing that they weren't engaging and trying to get them to engage and interact with their peers or you know, with us, is much harder to do online. It's much easier to be quite passive online and turn your camera off, turn your microphone off, get distracted, start searching for other things on the internet. So it's harder to sort of really keep people engaged. Conversations themselves aren't as natural. There's always a bit of a lag that's a bit awkward, that I'm sure we all know and we've all experienced with meetings and teaching online. And some of those subtleties of communication are lost, that facial expressions, the body language. It's just much harder to pick up on those things. At the end of the day, students can learn anything they like online these days. There's such a great resource, and there's such, you know, is presented in ways that are really clear and accessible. But ultimately, these students are choosing to come to university and learn in person with us because they want that interaction. I'll just quickly end by saying that Joe and I could have written about this and spoken about this endlessly. And one of the things that we didn't add in the paper, but I think would be interesting to consider and think about in the future, is the idea of gamification, because this is one area where people are willing to spend hours and hours online interacting in chat rooms and you know, staying engaged for so long. So looking at maybe ways of gamifying the way that we move things online as a way of keeping people engaged and keeping people interacting. So I suppose those practical advantages of increased flexibility can't replace the human interaction that comes with being there in the classroom with students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Echo and Joe. Really amazing insights. I think your insight that gaming students weren't happy to go online was really amazing for helping us remember not to make assumptions about which cohorts will enjoy online and which won't. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions at the end.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Our next presentation is from Nerina Dunt. Nerina is Acting Head of Department and Lecturer, Art History and Theory at Adelaide Central School of Art. Today, Nerina will be presenting Art Network Recovery, Maximising the Educational Experience After Crisis Mode. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Right, I'll just see if I can share this. Sorry, one sec. Sorry, I've lost my screen. Here we go. Okay. You can see that?
Yeah, I can see that. Did you want to go into presenter mode? Yep. And do you want to check that they move before they disappear? Yeah. Moving. Great.
Thanks so much. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nerina Dunt, and as mentioned, my paper today is entitled Network Recovery, Maximising the Educational Experience After Crisis Mode, which considers wellbeing and resilience in response to online course delivery. It's been useful to reflect on various studies that have come out of COVID-19 regarding teaching and learning. Published this year, Matthew White and Faye McCallum considered the question of whether COVID-19 has been an educational catalyst or crisis. And 18 months on from when South Australian education institutions dove into uncharted territory as a result of the pandemic, lockdown and the switch to online learning, we're closer to reaching a conclusion about this dichotomy. For many institutions, however, working out an answer at the time was challenging as executive, administration and teaching staff had to navigate how they might just get on with the job. White and McCallum acknowledged that wellbeing programs in places of education are critical for workforce planning and whole school improvement. And while wellbeing theory wasn't COVID-19 induced, having been a focus of teaching and learning research for more than a decade, it did become magnified as the risk of decreasing levels of wellbeing and resilience caused primarily from isolation during the pandemic rapidly became a reality. Such was the case at the institution that I'm affiliated with, Adelaide Central School of Art, or ACSA, as around 200 students were faced with the prospect of online learning, which, unlike our competitor institutions, there was simply no precedent for this mode of delivery. How are we to successfully implement change in course delivery whilst navigating crisis mode, and how could we maintain wellbeing and embed resilience catalytically to maximise the educational experiences for both students and staff of the school on the other side of the crisis? Answers to these questions are considered throughout the paper. But first, a timeline. In March of 2020, Adelaide schools and tertiary institutions went into lockdown and stringent restrictions. For ACSA, this meant an 8-week term, that is, the second half of semester 1, engaged in online learning from 20th of April to 26th of June. It's important that I mention here the foresight of the academic executive. For the final 2.5 weeks of term 1, beginning 18th of March, the academic executive suspended classes, including the assessment tasks associated with those classes, taking the immediate pressure off teaching staff. What this meant was that this period of time, along with a 2-week mid-semester break that followed, left teaching staff with 4.5 weeks to prepare for term 2. The switch to online delivery was implemented school-wide, with the exception of some honours classes where 2 units were able to maintain partial access to campus, given the low student numbers enrolled. So to give some context here, as you'd well be aware, as an art school, pre-COVID-19, our teaching model was wholly face-to-face in all units across our Bachelor of Visual Art, Associate Degree of Visual Art and Bachelor of Visual Art honours. And I just want you to imagine sculpture, painting, drawing, all hands-on, practical, studio-based subjects pushed to online delivery, along with all art history and theory units. Despite the seemingly rushed nature to roll out online delivery, 4.5 weeks was long enough for teaching staff to catch their breath. It was a significant amount of time spent upskilling and using an online learning management system, tweaking the curriculum timeline given that suspension of classes at the 6-week mark of term, and figuring out best practice pedagogy for online teaching and learning when classes resumed in their new format. So what did this mean for staff and students who found themselves physically teaching and learning on their own? Were they at risk of hyper-individualism? If you take hyper-individualism to simply mean a tendency for people to act in a highly individual way without regard to society, then potentially yes. Staff and students were unable to meet and interact on campus, excluded physically to individual zones. Zachary A. Casey's definition sees hyper-individualism as the tendency in a liberal individualist society for social actors to understand themselves as disparate entities rather than primarily as members of collectives or groups, who find reinforcement in their individuality to the extent that social categories lose any and all meaning. Casey goes on to describe hyper-individualism as everyone being independent social agents, independently responsible for their social location and social realities. Aware of how the immediacy of imposed changes to the social dynamic of ACSA, combined with the 4.5-week break and isolation from the school network, and the anticipation of an additional 8 weeks online teaching and learning that was to follow, the capacity for hyper-individualism, lack of engagement and social disconnectedness in particular was a red flag, something that could possibly undermine the well-being of ACSA's community. The learning management system that ACSA opted into was a critical choice in addressing this concern. The school subscribed to open learning, whose objective it is to provide a social and engaging experience, prioritising collaboration and community for learners. And while perhaps software is intelligent rather than clever, I like to think that matched with ACSA's values, it was cleverly devised and well suited to its purpose. Not only did the open learning software facilitate online teaching and learning, but it allowed ACSA to establish and maintain online a strong social network, somewhat resembling that experienced on campus. The format of the open learning platform for teaching was such that lectures and demonstrations could be recorded and uploaded into organised folders, along with additional audio-visual and text-based resources. Attendance at a weekly Zoom class was compulsory, and students were encouraged to be available on both video and microphone during class. Anticipating that access to open learning and the virtual Zoom classroom could be challenging for some students, workstations were erected on campus where 1 or 2 students could attend at a time in line with government restrictions. This option enabled all students to have access to class. One of the clever features of open learning is the way discussion is configured as a forum, designed to build student interaction as an alternative for traditional topic-led conversation that would naturally occur in class. Across all subjects, whether in response to the teaching resources, class instructions, or posed reflective questions, students were highly engaged in this function of the learning management system. And by way of example, you can see on screen how a question is raised by the lecturer and students respond. Teachers were explicit in directing class members to one another's forum posts to not only comment, but generate conversations online, which were organised by threads and rather organically embedded community into classes, despite the physical separations experienced. This in turn contributed to students feeling connected to one another and built wellbeing and resilience amongst classmates, demonstrated through their ability to overcome adversity and thus experience positive outcomes despite an aversive situation, particularly as their competence with the software grew. Aware of various impacts of isolation, such as adjustment difficulties, stress and anxiety, some additional supports were put in place alongside open learning that were significant for students to maintain connection with the school despite the remote circumstances. The first was ongoing support from the Student Liaison Officer. Students were able to communicate with the officer for the duration of online learning. Operations, facility and administrative staff were also available for ongoing technical support over the course of the term. And finally, the school's student counsellor was available for phone consultations. Staff support was built through Zoom check-ins with leadership and with peers. Despite not being able to undertake excursions to Adelaide's eminent art institutions, as would typically occur at points throughout each unit, special guests in the way of artists and industry professionals were engaged to speak to students via Zoom or with recorded talks uploaded to the open learning platform. These service and academic supports contributed to both students and staff being able to continue to participate in ACSA's networks, maintaining community engagement in learning. From the outset, as students were briefed on the delivery of online learning, expectations around inclusion were also set. This was established through reference to the school's diversity, inclusion and equal opportunity policy, but also best practice for online interaction. This attention to inclusive practice was deliberate, particularly as a means to encourage students to reflect on their self-awareness as they interacted with one another, and ultimately building care into both the staff and student community. The significance of this was that in terms of wellbeing, such practice contributed to a positive climate for learning. A few students' anecdotes express this positivity, shown on screen. For teachers specifically, ACSA's lecturers had to revise their approach so that high impact strategies could be maintained through the change. This involved innovation and application across all subjects. In painting, staff made instructional videos and narrated slideshows that were uploaded as resources. In drawing, projects were adapted and substituted so that learning outcomes could be achieved in a student's home space. Similarly, in sculpture, new projects were established that allowed students to consider their entire home and contents as studios, and these changes had fruitful results. Across each of these practical subjects, students were encouraged to both video document their work and document with still images. All documentation, with the addition of reflection on ideas, methods and outcomes, were uploaded to the Open Learning platform for comment and for feedback by their teachers and peers. And this process was complemented by the Zoom sessions, where students were introduced to the weekly topics and tasks, able to critique uploaded content, have lectures presented and discuss content and resources. In the second semester of 2020, the delivery of practical subjects returned to campus. The easing of some restrictions meant that low numbers of students in studios could be accommodated. However, this meant that teaching in multiple spaces was required. The impact of this was that the delivery of art, history and theory from first year studies through to honours had to remain online. Staff were confident that this dual split of course delivery would retain all of the positive features and outcomes of Term 2, yet offer enhanced experiences of wellbeing for students as they return primarily to face-to-face learning. While open learning continued as the main space for art, history and theory, for the practical subjects, the platform became more of a resource repository, a digital space that pre-COVID-19 had never been taken advantage of. With the release of the 2020 results of the Quilt Student Experience Survey, ACSA polled extremely well, coming in at #1 in Australia for overall student educational experience for undergraduates studying creative arts, #1 in South Australia for overall student educational experience for undergraduates of all courses, and in a national context, second across both Australian universities and non-university higher education institutions for undergraduate student experience. Across all areas measured for learning experience, including skills development, learning engagement, teaching quality, student support, learning resources, and quality of entire educational experience, from 2019 data through to 2020 data, ACSA's ratings rose. This improvement, which is such an affirmation for the school, generates questions around whether both online delivery and the dual split delivery were critical factors in the success measured through the survey. As planning for 2021 got underway, it was time to consider how the success encountered through what was a response to crisis could be maximised as the school shifted into a post-crisis period, a period of recovery. The pandemic had forced change on the school, but there was a continued opportunity present to use that imposed change as a catalyst for consolidating what it had learned through the experience. One aspect reinforced to staff was that strong pedagogical practice has the capacity to combat the risks associated with hyper-individualism, contributing to wellbeing and resilience regardless of educational setting. This starts with professional leadership from the top down, community engagement in learning, a positive climate for learning, and excellence in teaching and learning. Through funneling these elements into the parameters set by COVID-19 in crisis mode, staff honed their abilities to build collectivity, social meaning, and feelings of togetherness which manifested as genuine care for the wellbeing of students. as practical-based subjects returned to their usual studios without space restrictions, and art history and theory was also welcomed back to campus, this recognised dimension of teaching and learning was applied at a macro level. Finally, while incorporating an online learning management system was a necessity during crisis mode, it really did revolutionise aspects of the pedagogical model, simultaneously highlighting ACSA's flexibility and adaptability and its own institutional resilience. Continued use of open learning throughout 2021, though to a much lesser extent, has allowed us to centralise resources, be more targeted in how those resources are used, but ultimately to expand students' capacity to reach success in their respective courses. Open learning has remained a complementary teaching resource as students and staff have reconnected with one another through unimpeded access to campus. More than just a safety net for curriculum delivery through this period of recovery though, it has been part of a process contributing to students' overall achievement, which factors into their feeling good and functioning effectively, their general sense of well-being. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Nerina. Great to help us consider what we should take forward and what unexpected good things have come out of a crisis, as you said. So thank you so much. Over to our final presentation. This is from Katie Lee. Katie is a cross-disciplinary artist whose creative practice includes sculpture, installation, performance, video, sound and drawing, and is a lecturer in creative arts and expanded performance at Deakin University. Today, Katie will be presenting A/Live, Synchronicity in Art and Online Teaching. Over to you, Katie.
Hi, thanks very much, and thank you to all those amazing presenters. I think some of what I might say today is perhaps repeating some of the things that you guys have observed as well, and perhaps in some places offering slightly different perspectives. So I really enjoy hearing your thoughts. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm living and creating my work on unceded Wurundjeri lands, and I'd like to pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge that my research and my thinking takes place amongst and in relation to this rich cultural context. So I'm not going to share a slideshow with you at this moment, but I will share a screen in a while. It should go without saying that this paper is set against the backdrop of challenges brought about specifically by the COVID-19 pandemic and teaching higher education remotely over the last 18 months. However, as we emerge from the devastation COVID-19 has wrought upon the economy and higher education in particular, rather than relaxing, I believe it's more important than ever to keep our eye firmly trained on what best practice looks like with regards to face-to-face synchronous classroom teaching in the creative arts. As universities scramble to consider new economic models, we are entering into a deeply unstable transition between what we did to survive COVID and the new normal. During this period, changes that were rolled out during a global emergency are becoming fait accompli. Unfortunately, these decisions are occurring before we've had a chance to find out what post-COVID recovery looks like for our sector, with universities already rolling out sweeping reforms to the way education operates and is delivered. Therefore, it's important to have thought very carefully what it is specifically that we value about concepts such as liveness and synchronicity, concepts that we may have previously taken for granted with regards to teaching. These concepts are important to consider, not because these qualities should be automatically considered best practice in all educational contexts, but because they link to very particular aspects of delivering creative arts education that I believe we need to safeguard, and more importantly, know why. During the pandemic, there was much talk of the flipped classroom. This model refers to a shift in the way lecturers spend time with students, both in the classroom and in the lecture theatre, away from delivering content or imparting knowledge during synchronous class time face-to-face, to a model whereby students are provided with this material asynchronously and use the time in the classroom to discuss the material or any outcomes that they have produced. This coincides with a move towards the content of lectures being delivered in bite-sized pieces. In an article published in the Times Education from the 17th of January, Trish McCluskey, Associate Provost of Learning and Teaching at Victoria University, was quoted as saying, "There is no place for lectures in VU's block teaching model." While McCluskey noted that some lecturers were strong storytellers, the format was too long. Presentations of 15 to 20 minutes, the typical duration of a TED talk, were superior because that's the amount of time that students are known to be able to concentrate for. Of course, VU is not alone. In fact, many, if not most institutions are considering permanent changes to the value they place on face-to-face lecture time. Again, quoting from the Times Higher Education, Perth's Curtin University proposes to scrap all lectures by the end of the year. They will be replaced by curtain talks, short videos of 10 to 15 minutes, each based on a single topic or concept, with students expected to watch 2 or 3 a week for the subject. Murdoch University are giving teaching staff 18 months to transition away from lectures. Instead, information previously delivered through lectures will be curated and squeezed into mini lectures and integrated with online activities. Citing similar moves occurring at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Lyriard from University College London's Institute of Education has warned. As Berkeley is an admirer institution, its decisions will be ammunition for those people within any university discussion going on at the moment about the future of teaching and learning. They will say, Berkeley is doing it, it's time we rethought it as well, she said. In other words, once this model is established, a new set of targets will emerge. These targets are not only educationally motivated, they are also economic. Herein lies the problem. If it is possible to deliver asynchronized bite-sized lectures without the need for physical lecture theatres, how long will we be able to argue for the economic value of in-person studio time? Throwing away the large lecture theatre model, which research has shown may not be best practice either, will place even more emphasis on visual arts and studio-based curricula, which on paper start to look very expensive to run. I need to stop for a moment to clarify my position. I understand that more broadly, these changes to the method and mode of delivery are due to very convincing trends and facts regarding the way students consume education. Even before the pandemic, students were not necessarily showing up to live lectures. I recall pre-pandemic discussing this with a friend who teaches mathematics to enviably large cohorts. He regularly orated lectures and annotated the old-fashioned blackboard to completely empty lecture theatres. Changes to modes of delivery and student engagement were already well underway, actively facilitated by lecture capture and LMS. However, sweeping reforms to the lecture theatre mode of delivery cited above risk standardising the way that we teach and establishing an economic model that will A, not suit all subject areas and B, all students. Further, it will set up an economic model that will increasingly draw attention to those who don't or can't deliver such lean packages, and in doing so, will be asked to rationalise our pedagogical approach. I have to say, unfortunately, this gloomy perspective is not speculative. As I speak, the university I work for has rolled out a further reduction of creative arts staff, citing student-to-staff ratios and decreeing the death of the lecture theatre, if not in the same breath, then certainly within the same meetings. In a world now filled with online content, recorded Zoom sessions, skill-sharing educational platforms with hours and hours of content, I'm increasingly interested in the role that liveness and synchronicity play in our perception, to our sense of connectedness to the world and to what it is that we value. I'm going to shift gears now and begin to weave in some of my related research concerns, and I'll begin with some reflections. In the early 2000s, I used to turn on public TV Channel 31 at random times. Every now and then I would encounter a strange live stream, a cropped image of someone's darkened studio desk and part of a tropical fish tank. The shot wasn't framed to catch any action. In fact, there was no visible change other than a fish that would occasionally dart past. However, because I knew it was live, there was an energy, a presence. I was completely mesmerised and would keep it on for hours, even though nothing was happening. I'm just going to share my screen. This is a live stream. A peregrine falcon has nested on the sill of 367 Collins Street. Pictured now out of shot. I regularly turn on the radio to listen live. I distinguish my desire for live radio from my desire to listen to podcasts. I don't always want to choose the delivery of information in bite-sized packets. I want to open myself to chance, to listen to something I didn't know I'm interested in. I've started using live radio in my performance installations, turning it on and off as I move sculptural elements around in the work. I use ABC Radio live news radio to shift my mind and attention outward and to be reminded of global weather, international politics, and the traffic building up on the Westgate Freeway. Other people, other problems, other lives. By switching it on and off at intervals, I offer my mind, along with the context of my work, to outside worlds and to chance. I invite new relations between myself and others and allow myself to be influenced and affected. I am not a singular artist working in a hermetically sealed gallery. Outside the interiority of the gallery world, other things are happening. I once accidentally sat behind a row of parked cars, waiting impatiently to turn left into a busy intersection. Several cycles of the traffic lights passed before I realised that I wasn't waiting, I had stopped. The shift in sensation from one state of mind, waiting, to the other, stopped, was a fully embodied transition, a reorientation of my understanding of what was going on in the world. These sensations felt physical, palpable, different, yet externally they were exactly the same. In one, I was awaiting change, chance, luck. In the other, I had stopped. Nothing would happen to me. I was stuck. It can be argued that the perception that nothing is happening is a particularly Western frame of mind. For example, Indigenous Australians understand reciprocity between self and country to be foundational, ongoing, pulsing, alive. Bundjalung Muruwai Kameraloi artist Dr. Brian Martin has written extensively about the problematic way that Western ontologies result in representationalist thinking, particularly the way that Western ontologies separate out culture from everyday life. If culture and everyday life are separated, then art can only hope to represent rather than present, or be in reciprocal and dynamic exchange with life. Martin describes how this fundamental Western ontological position is antithetical to an Indigenous worldview. Within an arts context, the concept of reciprocity, /liveness, and Indigenous knowledge applies in particular. As Martin states, the relatedness that we have to the world around us can also be seen in the inseparable relationality that we have to making cultural things. A pragmatic example we can use to demonstrate the separation is the use of the term art. In the multiple Aboriginal languages in Australia, we do not find the word art. Art is a Western term and could be argued as something stationary or static, and has at many times throughout history separated itself out from the social and the real world. The use of the word yucca in Wurundjeri language means to paint, which is a demonstration of the action of doing. Yucca has agency and relationality to the maker, the viewer, to knowing. With much talk circulating around universities about the importance of decolonising the curriculum, one has to wonder at what point these new flipped methods of delivery will be evaluated for bias. Have we stopped to consider and evaluate the broader implications of separating out human interaction from the delivery of information? These decisions may have serious cultural implications, and I've already witnessed a myriad of social and emotional ones experienced by creative arts students undertaking online learning, with no shared studio practice or human contact provided by face-to-face learning. The flipped classroom model allows for, or perhaps more accurately presupposes, that students access the material before a live synchronous class and arrive prepared for interactive discursive learning experiences. Research undertaken during the pandemic shows that this mode of delivery might indeed be appropriate for certain kinds of knowledge acquisition. For example, evidence suggests so-called hard skills linked to technical competence, working with equipment, data, software, may benefit from these kinds of flipped classroom innovations. Yet the same body of research has found that soft skills, those that deal with intrapersonal skills, such as one's ability to manage oneself, as well as interpersonal skills, such as how one handles one's interactions with others, unsurprisingly, may not. The same body of research revealed that these active pedagogies are actually not always welcomed by students, who point out that their lack of inclination for active learning and performing tasks outside the classroom, admitting that they're not used to taking control of their own learning. To flip the model, it seems to me, asks our students to arrive at university fully equipped to be model university citizens with more discipline than held by most professionals. In fact, at the same time universities were proposing students practice or studied alone throughout the pandemic, I was gratefully attending Shut Up and Write sessions with academics from across the university, coming together on Zoom to sit in silence as we got on with our work. The Shut Up and Write model was initiated to create accountability and habit formation, along with social motivation and support that one would assume you could get at university. In these sessions, we do not know each other, nor do we discuss our work or engage in lively, active discussions. We just sit together, practicing in silence. I tried many different methods of teaching online over the last 18 months, including giving students the option to flip. However, as excruciating as 3-hour synchronous Zoom sessions were, screens full of blank tiles indicating switched off cameras, stilted conversations, prolonged silence, synchronous live sessions proved incredibly important to the students. Many reported back to me that the sessions of practicing together, live and imperfect, were nevertheless a highlight of their week. The classes represented a period of time, a duration, put aside for practicing together. Like any habit or discipline, setting time aside, tuning in and being in an environment with others doing the same is what facilitates the learning. In the creative arts, we model durational practice. We model not knowing. What's interesting about the value of being together online is that it can be done in silence with our cameras off. Teaching drawing online using live feed webcams, such as the one I have shared with you today, we sat in silence, all looking through the same portal, sharing a moment separate and together. Importantly, we also shared risk. Inevitably, the webcams I had curated for the students to work from their drawing classes would have missing animals, such as the one here, empty nests, internet streaming issues. However, it was exactly this unpredictability and the way we recovered together, drawing empty nests and various other solutions, which the exchange, the practice and the learning occurred. By asking students to come to class ready to present finished works, we once again prioritise final products over active relational processes and lose our hard-fought emphasis in creative arts research to the process of learning, finding new ways of being and knowing through practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. I love your reflections on why it's important to practice simultaneously, even with cameras off. The duration of the class time is something that I will ponder deeply now. So thank you.
And I ain't saying it's pretty.
So that was our final presentation for today, and we do have some time for questions. So I invite everyone to turn their cameras on because we would love to kind of have a discussion about what's been shared today. I'm just having a look through the chat, but if anyone would like to jump in, that would be excellent.
I might jump in if I can. So I had a question, but before I jump to it, I just wanted to say how beautifully crafted the way you spoke was, Katie, just about liveness and stuff. I think it's kind of so important. So I just wanted to say.
Oh, thank you. I'm absolutely thrilled to know that you remember that fish tank, because it's like, oh my God, I didn't think anyone would. Wasn't it?
I lived in Melbourne a long time ago, and as soon as you said it, it's like I know that I know that image. It's kind of like bizarre. What I thought it might be good to talk about for a second, and it sounds kind of like really dull in one way, and it's just this kind of question of platforms. And I just wanted to sort of bring together, you know, that first observation about like using, because when we went online at UNSW, which we did really quickly, we had our courses very well documented on Moodle because we'd been through a course development process. So they were already really well built. So that was good. But we had no platform for online teaching, and we all kind of made our own decisions in some ways, and from a couple of options. And I chose to take all the graphics courses online using Teams because partly because of the legacy information that exists of the conversations, and that relates to that which Carly and I were talking about with our communities of practice, that actually, you know, outside the moment when you're together live, you can still go back to that discussion. And whereas with Blackboard, for example, one of the things about it was once it was gone, it was kind of gone. And then also that sort of related to Nerina talking about open learning. And actually, I'm doing a course at the moment in open learning, and it's such a kind of like a beautifully crafted kind of platform. So I just wondered if anyone had any kind of thoughts about just about platforms generally, or which have worked, or the decisions that you've made about which platforms to use or not to use. It's sort of an open question to everyone.
I only have something brief to say, so others might elaborate. But I became a bit of a team zealot quite early on, because I was desperately searching for that over-the-shoulder moment that students could have with each other, and the LMS system that we use at Deakin is a bit clunky for that. There's not that sort of, the students aren't very well schooled in the chats or the discussions or the forum boards. So we weren't using Teams for our live streaming or video conferencing, but I ended up starting to feel like I had infiltrated Microsoft and I was being some sort of salesperson. It was quite uncomfortable, but it was the only thing I could find that I was trying to rattle and try and get that moment so that students could have that sort of sense of almost it being like a blog that they had agency and control over. They could load things up at any time. We could comment and chat, and it wasn't perfect or even something that they all adopted, but it was the only thing that I found that really, managed to achieve that sort of classroom environment.
I mean, I had the same reaction that I kind of wanted everything that we discussed to always be there. So a bit like you pin it up in the room and it remains there afterwards. And that sort of seemed important. I know what you mean about like waving the Microsoft flag, which is not. For me, it became about actually I just need to do something. What's gonna be the best?
How far we've come so quickly, isn't it? Like we weren't using Teams at all, and I guess we hadn't really had to think about these things. So it was. It took a while too for us to actually, and there's resistance as well because it is extra admin, and I think that's the other thing is that these platforms become kind of hungry administrative drags as well. But I still think they're important.
Echo, you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah, look, it was interesting. We used Blackboard and we used sort of discussion forums as much as possible for that asynchronous moment of collaboration for the students. But we always found that some students were particularly great in engaging on the forum, and we just lost some students completely. And it was interesting that it was it was the students who were usually really engaged in the face-to-face classroom weren't the ones that were particularly engaged in a kind of forum context. What students ended up doing is a fair bit of their own versions of ways to collaborate outside of class. They used, some of them had just WhatsApp chats going, and others were using Teams, set up their own team. There seemed to be, we used Blackboard in an official way and gave them forums to use officially, but there was this sort of organic breakaway. This is what we're going to use. And it was interesting because we got them to still show us their design process when they had in their journals, and a lot of it was just a lot of screenshots of things like WhatsApp, and that's when we realized that they'd broken away and found their own ways of collaborating in their own platforms that they were most familiar with and they could use the best, and the official avenues weren't necessarily that popular.
Nerina?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, and this is something I didn't include in my talk, but we actually made their participation online an accessible component. Did others do that as well?
No, we didn't.
Okay.
But
I feel like
should have.
It's an interesting question. We didn't, I think, because our turnaround had to be so fast and we couldn't actually change the accessible. We couldn't change the accessible nature of the course, but it's a really good question. because then there was conversations of, well, camera on, camera off. Does that mean engagement, non-engagement? But then there's issues of equality. Some people have their cameras off for reasons that are fair enough, and other people have them off because they're watching Netflix. Yeah, but it really, it's something we're wondering too, Nerina, as in how do we take that forward if this is going to have some legacy in the online space as well, now that we go back to both modes for a while. And did you find that it was successful? Would you advocate for it?
Yeah, so it was more the attendance. So the attendance was accessible. So they basically had to show up every week to get that assessment point. And I feel like, you know, whether it's habit or they just got into the swing of things quite organically, I felt, in my courses. But I do have the dream team here with me, some of my teaching colleagues. They might want to add to the discussion there. Roy or Johnny?
Sorry, I'm just on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, I mean, in terms of that, what Carly mentioned of having to adhere to existing allocations of percentages and things like that, all our courses have a kind of what could loosely be called a participation mark built in, which covers things like attendance, but also, you know, contribution to critique around work and in-class discussions and things like that. So I guess we already had that kind of built into the assessment criteria that it was sort of enforceable. But yeah, I mean, I think we were really impressed with how on board students were and how their capacity for online engagement. Like, I know Johnny's here as well, and Johnny, you were running really quite extensive critiques of work, you know, that was posted in the online galleries that were comparable to how long we'd spend in the studio. And yeah, I mean, I think like it sounds like we're just sort of spruiking ourselves, but further to some of those great stats and things that Nerina showed, you know, I think we were all kind of a bit like, oh, what are enrollments going to look like in semester 2? And in fact, they were kind of, the semester 2 enrollments in 2020 were better than in 2019. So I don't know, I think there was that sense of perhaps like, I think we all kind of thought perhaps is the attitude going to be, oh, the world's ending, what's the point? Or the world's ending, fuck it, I'm going to do what I really want to do and study creative arts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you showed, there's been some amazing results, so I think you can spruik. I would love to keep going because this is really helpful and fruitful, but I don't want to get in trouble for making us late. So I will officially close this session, but would love to catch up in later times if anyone wants to discuss things that came up in this session. Taya's just very kindly put in the link to the next session, and I just want to again thank all of our presenters today, and yeah, thank you for a fantastic session.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Sharing.